swear an oath to the Constitution, not to any one president. Many of us have worked alongside or in the military for a long time and care deeply about it remaining apolitical. And we're seeing now active duty military Army being sent to the border, being sent on missions right now to support DHS. But according to our Constitution, the U.S. military active duty cannot perform law enforcement roles.
Okay, I have to stop this video right here. So I only included this clip for this particular point. So I had no idea who this senator was. I'd never heard of her before this hearing. And she made a point. She said that the Constitution prohibits active duty military from performing law enforcement function. That is wrong. So it's not the Constitution. It's actually a law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which I will likely do a video on later. So the Posse Comitatus Act is basically a 2-sentence statute that prohibits active duty military from performing law enforcement functions, which makes sense, right? We don't want our active duty military running around acting like police in our cities. But it's not the Constitution, so she's wrong on that point. So I was like, well, maybe she's not a lawyer. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe it's just an honest mistake. So I looked it up. Yeah, that's true. She is not a lawyer. She's actually a former CIA analyst. So she's a CIA analyst, served in Iraq as a CIA analyst, and she is a senator from Michigan. So just wanted to have that point of clarification. It's a Posse Comitatus Act, and it was actually passed in the late 1800s and has a kind of unique history. And so that's why I think I'll do a video. Welcome back to Military Law Talks. So today's video is on the Posse Comitatus Act. And before I get into the act itself, I want to provide a little history because there's a lot of history involved in this law, and it's pretty unique. So this idea of a posse comitatus, it is actually a Latin term. So it dates back all the way back to Roman times, where government officials maybe need additional help to perform some law enforcement function. So they literally round up a posse. So they get local men to help conduct law enforcement functions. And back in England, during the monarchy, it was used. So we had a local sheriff would round up men, usually age 15 and older, to maybe arrest someone, suppress lawlessness, protect property, or in general, keep the peace. And so we in America kind of imported this idea from England. And so there is an aversion, though, to using military troops for local law enforcement, which eventually led to the Posse Comitatus Act being passed. And history really explains why. And so thinking back to Revolutionary War times, we had the Boston Massacre. And so this was actually kind of an event that was a culminating event that had several months kind of leading up to this unfortunate event where I believe 5 people died and several were injured. But what happened is that, there was unrest in the colonies. There was a high tax burden from the British, and the colonists weren't happy about it. And so the British regulars, the British redcoats, they were actually occupying the city of Boston, and they were a legit occupying force. They were, patrolling streets, trying to break up assemblies and protests, and they were trying to enforce the law of Britain back, in the colonies. And the colonies really resented this occupying British force. And so oftentimes they would do things in protest or try to disparage or mock the troops. And what led up to the day of the Boston Massacre was actually in the winter, and there was a snowball fight, and lots of, a big crowd was hurling insults at the British troops. And not really sure exactly, but firing happened. So at least one, multiple people fired, but one started it. And then there was more troops firing on the local citizens. And like I said, about 5 people died, but I think over 15 were injured. And so that kind of started this whole idea of Americans being really upset about having military troops patrolling in the US. However, again, the Posse Comitatus Act banning active duty military to perform law enforcement function didn't occur for another 100 years before that passes. And so there's some more history that we need to go over. And so prior to its passage, routinely Army soldiers were used to do local law enforcement functions, particularly by federal marshals. So there weren't a whole lot of federal marshals, and so that they would impress active duty Army soldiers to help either arrest people or enforce the peace, put down rebellions or mobs. And so when the troops were working for either the federal marshal or a local sheriff, they were under the command and control of that civilian sheriff or local law enforcement official instead of a military commander. And really what led to the passage of the Posse Comitatus Act was the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. So, right, we fought a civil war, and then after the Civil War, the northern troops, Union Army troops, basically were an occupying force in the South. And so that's why, today we have a lot of our military installations are actually in the South. And that dates back to all the way to, Civil War, pre-Civil War times. And so the troops were there to help enforce really the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, civil rights, and particularly voting rights. So they helped secure voting locations, helped to secure the vote for freed Black slaves and even poor whites. And so they were stationed throughout the South to help enforce the law and to provide civil rights to newly freed slaves. But the Southern Democrats, they were pretty upset about that. And so they eventually got control of the House in 1876, and they tried to pass a law to prohibit Army troops from being, as part of a posse comitatus, from performing a law enforcement function, particularly in the South. And they initially tried to pass that bill as part of an Army appropriations bill. And I thought that was a really interesting fact because we do the same thing today. And so it's not a new idea that, we pass some unrelated bill in the appropriations bill because it's a must pass bill. We got to fund the military. And so they were doing it all the way back, over 150 years ago. But that bill failed in the Senate. And so 2 years later, they had to try again. So it eventually did pass in 1878. And really this and a presidential election that was contested, not unlike, it was actually eerily similar to the 2020 election. And maybe I'll do another video on that. That it was essentially the end of Reconstruction. And after Reconstruction and after the troops left the South, that gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow, and disenfranchisement of freed slaves in the South. And so you really could tie the two together, that the Posse Comitatus Act is what led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow, and essentially suppressing the Black vote for probably 100 or, at least 70 years. And so most Americans totally support the Posse Comitatus Act because we don't want U.S. troops, active duty Army troops patrolling our streets. However, this is kind of an unintended consequence of the bill, or maybe intended consequence, since it was really pushed by Southern Democrats, that it allowed the Jim Crow South to flourish. And so this is the act itself. So it says it's 18 USC 1385, which is unique. It is a criminal statute. So all the criminal statutes are found in the 18 series, the Title 18 of the US Code. And so it is very short. It just says whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army or the Air Force. Now that part was added later, the Air Force, right? Because the Air Force didn't exist until after World War II. As a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. And so, like I said, this is a criminal statute. However, I could not find a single case where someone was actually criminally prosecuted under the Posse Comitatus Act for violating it. And really, the reason that we follow it is it's really kind of a show of military restraint, that we know it's out there and we ensure that we don't violate it. Now, there's exceptions right in the law, right? It says an exception is by the Constitution, if there's a constitutional exception or act of Congress. And so there are several constitutional exceptions to this law. So allowing active duty military, Army, but specifically Army, Posse Comitatus applies specifically to the Army and the Air Force. There's another law for the Navy. Legal interpretations have included the Marines under the Army or under the Navy, I'm sorry. And so they would follow a different law. But the constitutional exceptions would be one, to execute the laws of the Union. And we'll give a real life example of that. Suppress insurrections or repel invasions. That's what's going on right now. So when Trump took office, he declared this border crisis an invasion, that we had these migrant groups invading the border. And so since he declared it an invasion, that allowed active duty military, particularly its Army, it's a big Army mission, to go to the border and suppress this invasion. And we've had, there's an Insurrection Act that was passed, I believe, in 1807 that allows the active duty Army to suppress insurrections. And that's been invoked multiple times. We'll talk about a couple examples of that. Protect states against invasions. I think one could argue, right, the border is not only invasion of the US, but invasion of the states. Protect the states' rights to have a Republican form of government and against domestic violence. Again, I mean, not like interfamily in a home domestic violence, but within the country, that's what it's talking about. And then states are prohibited from keeping their own armies. However, they do have militias. And now that the militia was the old term, now it's known as the National Guard. And so the Posse Comitatus, in effect, it prohibits federal troops from being used for domestic law enforcement functions. Some examples would be like making arrests, transporting prisoners, doing searches and seizures, right? Like walking through neighborhoods and searching homes. That would be prohibited from this law. But also even simple things like directing traffic would technically be a law enforcement function, and that would be prohibited. But this law specifically does not apply to the Coast Guard. It's really important to understand. The Coast Guard actually does law enforcement functions all the time. So Congress has actually vested law enforcement functions power to the Coast Guard. And so the Coast Guard routinely, I would probably argue maybe on a daily basis, does conduct and assist federal law enforcement in arrests, searches, and seizures, particularly for drug trafficking. And also important to note, it does not apply to the National Guard in a Title 32 status. Now, a Title 32 status means that the National Guard has been called up by the state governor, and they are acting under the state governor's authority. So while they're in a Title 32 status, that means that the state governor is their commander-in-chief. National Guard can be federalized, though. So that is a Title 10 status. So when National Guard is in a Title 10 status, the president is the commander-in-chief. But when they're in a Title 32 status, they're paid by the state, and the state governor is their commander-in-chief, and the Posse Comitatus Act does not apply. All right, and so the Posse Comitatus Act has remained on the books since 1878. Like I said, there's been no known criminal cases, but the military follows it because of military restraint. And I'm going to tell you, as a active duty judge advocate, I taught the Posse Comitatus Act to troops on a fairly regular basis. So most people in the Army, particularly, I would say all commanders, know this law exists and knows that military, active duty military or army in particular, cannot perform this local law enforcement function. All right, and then let's talk about some modern examples of either Posse Comitatus or exceptions to it. So one is Little Rock, Arkansas. So this was after Brown versus Board of Education. We're going to desegregate local schools, and the governor of Arkansas refused. And so the president actually called in federal troops to enforce civil rights. And so remember, that's one of the exceptions to enforce, the federal law. And so that was an exception where troops, and I think it was mostly federalized National Guard who were called in. And so remember, and federal law also provides an ability to suppress any insurrections. And so so if you go to this link, Life Magazine, or if you just search Little Rock, Arkansas Life Magazine, you can see pictures, and it's very clear. I mean, there's military, the Army soldiers at the school ensuring that the Black students trying to integrate the school could go to school and not be harmed. Another way that this is another exception to Posse Comitatus is the Insurrection Act. And so particularly, around the civil rights time, around the same time period, there were lots of racial unrest. And so in particular, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were race riots in cities all over the US, particularly bad race riots in DC and Chicago, and I believe LA. And so I know personally, my dad he was in the Army at the time, and he was called up, his unit was called up to potentially go do riot duty in Chicago. So he was in Missouri at the time, I believe, or maybe Colorado. I don't remember which. It was before I was born. And so he was on standby. He told me that he had a lawyer come, a JAG come brief them on rules of force. And he really hoped he didn't have to go do riot duty, because that was like the last thing he wanted to do, is to go, potentially have to use force against fellow American citizens. Luckily, his unit wasn't needed. They were just kept in reserve. But what happened is, and I remember him telling me that story and thinking, how could they do that? You can't use active duty Army troops to go do law enforcement, to go do riot control. But what happened is LBJ, who was president at the time, he invoked the Insurrection Act, and that is what allowed him to call up active duty Army troops to go into these cities and do riot control. All right. And then a bad example of this is the Kent State shootings. And so again, lots of protesting. This is like Vietnam era protesting. And this was actually National Guard soldiers. So they weren't federalized troops, but unfortunately some students were killed during clashes between National Guard and student protests. All right. And then another modern example is Hurricane Katrina. So it was really the National Guard did a lot of the heavy lifting in the response, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and really the flooding. That was like the worst part. The Coast Guard did a lot. They had helicopters evacuating people. And then this is just a picture of, military. It looks like Army people, probably National Guard, but they're in the French Quarter patrolling the streets. And so another kind of exception, right, passed by law to Posse Comitatus. Now they're not performing a law enforcement function, but active duty military can be called up to help support local officials. So in an emergency, it's called, so it's a DISCA, it's Defense Support of Civilian Authorities. And so what happens if there's a local emergency? So like Hurricane Katrina, right? The local governor, if there declares an emergency, and if the local response is overwhelmed, they can call up the president. Really, it needs to be in writing, but it's usually a phone call. And then follow it up in writing, but by law, it has to be in writing. They make a written request to the president to ask for support. And post 9/11, it's Department of Homeland Security who's in the lead agency to provide that support. So the Department of Homeland Security can call up different governmental agencies, to include the DoD, to help support local officials that are overwhelmed and can't adequately respond. And when I briefed, in the past, military commanders on this, I tell them, much to your chagrin, you're not the one in charge. So the DoD is actually subordinate to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, who is subordinate to the local and state response. And so, and then how it's paid, technically the states are supposed to pay back. So they're supposed to reimburse the federal government for what they spent in that response. But there is a law called the Stafford Law that allows the federal government to cover up to 75% of those costs. So it's not as big of a burden on the states, particularly, right? They're responding after an emergency. All right. So modernly, the Posse Comitatus is still good law, but unlike the senator from Michigan, you now know that it's not the Constitution that restrains military members from patrolling the streets. It's Posse Comitatus Act. And technically, I would argue that the Constitution actually provides an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, right? So there's lots of laws, modern times, that Congress has allowed the military to sell military equipment to local law enforcement. That's why sometimes, right, we got like local law enforcement all kitted up and they're driving around in a Humvee. I personally don't think that's like a great thing, but Congress allows it, and also allows the military to train local law enforcement on that equipment, and sometimes assist in investigations, particularly with like drug trafficking or counterterrorism. And so while Posse Comitatus is an old law, it is still good law. It is still on the books. It's still a restraint on federal troops. And like I said, it is followed because of military restraint. So military members, commanders know that this law exists and they choose to follow it. All right, so that's all I have on the Posse Comitatus Act. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that thumbs up. And if you have any recommendations for future content, please put it in the comments and share this video out there. I'm a new channel, so help me grow. Please consider subscribing or sending this video and asking others to subscribe as well. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.